You are watching This League, the show about the biggest league in the whole wide world. I'm Peyton Gallagher. In New York, New York, it's the Oracle John Morrissey. Elsewhere in the country, probably Phoenix. Could be an end-of-the-world bunker. He just moves around to different ones of those. Is Ryan Sakura with some sound padding hanging off the wall behind him, courtesy of the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications. Folks, week number 4 of the USL Championship season. Not the headliners, maybe, that we had a week ago in terms of stories and intrigue, but these are the weeks in which the league campaign and the story of the season is written. We've got a lot to talk about. This is the Observational Invitational, where the head-turning observations of the two gentlemen sitting next to me are to be displayed. Number 1 in the book. We got anything in particular? Because I have something I have brought to show and tell, folks. Okay, the floor is mine.
Fearless leader, take it away.
Okay, Mikey Maldonado balled out this weekend, and I enjoyed watching the performance that he put in with Somersault in the pivot for North Carolina FC in a Southern Derby victory, a big one for NCSC. More than anything I saw this week, I've got plenty of thoughts. I want to see if that raises an eyebrow at all out of the two of you.
Yeah, I mean, kind of taking holistically what North Carolina was doing, and Maldonado in particular starring, I was so impressed with the press. This is against a Charleston team that very often is going to get Aaron Malloy low, almost create a three at the back look in the way they're building out. North Carolina always has three forwards. So they had the numbers to make sure that Malloy couldn't have easy progression downfield, but it's still about protecting that space in behind the first line, and that's where Maldonado came up big. Every time the battery tried to drop a runner in, tried to break lines and set themselves up to kind of climb that ladder up the field, either Maldonado or Somersault was making the step, marking that player, and making sure that Charleston, a team I think we're all convinced is going to be a very good attacking side at some point, couldn't get there. It was really great execution of what John Bradford has always set this team up to do in that kind of 5-2-3, holding the high line. We don't give the midfield enough credit for how dynamic they are, but I think that was a real showcase for it.
I think for me, the wingers, we don't give the midfield all the credit because the wingers are the center of the John Bradford system. It was probably the most John Bradford a John Bradford team could ever be. It's the ideal world for North Carolina in that back three shape with the two central midfielders. You play Dolabella in a place where he can occupy, but they do what they do, which is drag defenders towards them when the ball is at the back, and then try and split balls long and wide and get these athletes and these talented creators that Ezra Armstrong and Rafa Menzingen are. And they were really good, I thought, in the final third. That's how the goal came about, that opening goal. It really shouldn't have been Evan Conway's goal, in fairness, but it was. And I think that's the thing that stood out to me is we talked about North Carolina all the way back in week 1 of where are they going to insert Pedro Dolabella? How is that going to affect their identity, their growing identity as a team? Um, and now we're seeing what North Carolina is as an identity, which is the same thing with a super talented number 10, a really good on the ball number 8, next to Raheem Somersault, who's a really rangy and destructive type midfielder. It's a really good balance so far this year.
Yeah, that is interesting that you went immediately to the defensive aspect, John, because it was apparent, that is undeniable. Believe the really well put terminology used during the broadcast itself is it felt like North Carolina effectively disrupted Charleston's supply chain forward. And that meant even though Aaron Malloy, heavily involved in the game, ends up with 96 touches, I think it was over 75 passes for the game, typical Aaron Malloy stuff. Over the broad span of his career, it's a guy who's averaged about 13% of his passes negatively, mostly side to side, a little bit progressively. It felt like he was forced to, when he was able to get on the ball, go backwards a lot of times until North Carolina had to kind of shut up shop late and see out a result after having their lead cut in half at 2-1. The thing to me, though, that was by far the most overwhelmingly, I guess, exciting about the performance from Maldonado was his ability to pick up the ball in a deep area and then activate all of the attacking potential of those wingbacks. It feels like it's maybe been a little bit disconnected from the team concept so far this year. That ability to do the Pirlo thing, get on the ball super deep, hit a half turn and just spray a 50-yard pass in behind with accuracy, I think that's huge. And then I think you couple that with the fact that Summersall provided so much with his carriage that it pried open even more space for Maldonado to get on the ball. So that's the question for me going forward is that the partnership that North Carolina FC are kind of forced to go with just by the merit of, yeah, that performance was overwhelming in my mind.
So often the case has been it'll be one of those players next to Colin Martin, probably because of the presumption that Martin is the defensive presence they needed. He's somebody who can sit back, do very classic ball recycling things, but also destructive things in that position. I think if you want proof positive that Charleston maybe doesn't need that, can use Martin certainly in certain situations, but has what they need with Maldonado and Summersall, the way that they stopped Charleston is all the proof that John Bradford ought to have to say, when push comes to shove, this might be my first choice.
And I think Summersall, while not the tried and true holding midfielder that Colin Martin is, has a lot of the same abilities and tendencies to be able to do some of these things. Again, rangy, a good carrier, but he and Maldonado complement each other, I think, really well from the perspective of if you put them on a pie chart. We see it all the time of guys that cover different things. They're a really complementary pair on the ball, but they do a lot of the same things in a package that make them a good defensive pairing to make up for Martin as a 2-for-1, right? So Martin can come in and do a lot of things by himself, but you can get these guys on the field that do all the things that Martin do as a collective, and you get even more offensive upside going forward with these two on the pitch to feed Dolabella, to feed these wide players, and create more attacking opportunities.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because it's almost, I don't want to say addition by subtraction. That feels harsh to Colin Martin, but the understanding that because Martin is not out there, Maldonado has access to different areas. He is allowed to get a little bit deeper and not mess up the spacing of the buildup. And that ability that he has, which in my mind might be his best trait, to interpret space, is a little bit more allowed to shine through. I cannot wait to see how they figure out how to integrate Olex Anderson into this whole thing because theoretically, his pace, his ability to win that foot race when he is isolated, especially against teams that have been drawn up to press a player like Maldonado, could be lethal running next to a player like Evan Conway. And as we've talked about, Pedro Dolabella in behind that, that feels like a team that, if everything goes according to plan, and we've said this about a handful of teams so far, but I think it unlocks a ceiling in which, yeah, this team could win a title this year if that is how they're able to play through the spine of their team with the wingbacks adding that extra dimension in the attack. At least maybe have the best attack in the league.
That's why the league's so great, though, because we can say that about a lot of teams. We can say if they figure it out at the right time, and newsflash, all you've got to do is get into the playoffs, and that's the right time to figure it out, you can do some weird stuff. And I think that's what's cool about the league. I do think that they benefited a lot from North Carolina, that has benefited a lot from Charleston doing early season Charleston stuff in terms of trying to experiment. John, you've got a lot on Huso, stepping into that right back role, a different position.
Yeah.
But that's why Ezra Armstrong had a ton of space because Charleston was trying to do some different things in the midfield, and North Carolina properly punished that and took advantage and took 3 points against Charleston for the first time in 16 years, right? Like that's an amazing thing for them to hold their hat on, but it was, I think, a lot of ways because Charleston decided we're in the early stage of the year, we're going to try some things, we're going to do some different stuff.
Charleston, with neither Segmers nor Blackstock involved in this game, they could have said, hey, we've got Joey Akpinonu. We know he's played that position at least a little bit in the USL. Why don't we try something? Why don't we take Huso Landry, one of the best defensive midfielders in the league, and put him at right back? And I think there were a few moments where it seemed inspired, where he'd kind of tuck inside, do what he does as a ball progressor. You think about the sequence leading up to Charleston's penalty. That's him interplaying with Douglas Martinez, showing real inspiration on the ball that he honestly hasn't in other positions quite often. But overall, he's somebody who's learning a new spot. You felt the balance really feel off on that Ezra Armstrong goal. There were a couple other moments where he was just getting isolated. That's natural. That's not an indictment of him as a player or Ben Pierman for experimenting. But I think it was kind of evidence of this battery team isn't there yet in terms of the scheme, the system they're trying to run, and the players. I was very focused on Douglas Martinez in this game as somebody who just couldn't get involved whatsoever. There have been some bright moments for Martinez, who's sort of doing second striker, pseudo number 10 things at times, but with the ability to push over the top and give Charleston more of a direct aspect. That didn't play against the High Line. North Carolina was too organized, but then it shut them out, Charleston, from having him drop deep. Martinez isn't somebody who's going to receive with a presser on his back and really link play. You can imagine a world where the battery maybe have Emilio Icaza in that spot. They maybe have a healthy right back, and you're looking at a fundamentally different game. But still, that's taking nothing away from North Carolina. That's just the reality for Charleston right now.
Yeah, and we'll see what it looks like when MD Myers is incorporated, if he's incorporated, because he kind of feels like he's out of the picture right now. What that might look like, how that shuffles things, but yeah, for Charleston, we on the Hosu point, it's something they've tried before. Ben Pierman has been chasing this dragon for a while, it feels like, of how to keep this defensive solidity of the 4-2-3-1 and keep a four-man back line that is functional, but also find that defensive-minded midfielder that can give you the extra number, can step into those spaces and allow you to build with an extra player in that formation that allows Aaron Malloy to maybe tuck in a little bit deeper and be almost a center back on the ball in the first phase. I don't know if it is doable in the USL, quite frankly, just because the players who can do those things might be MLS caliber players. But Ryan, do you have any kind of measure of how this is going so far, and if Hostu is a player that can finally solve this algebraic equation?
I think he's the player that can at least get as close as they've come, Charleston, to finding that problem. But I would argue that maybe it's more about, for me, the second and third phase of attack rather than the
Okay.
build-up phase of dropping Malloy in. You need him to drop in. You need him to be that facilitator in the back. But I've always felt like the one thing that, Charleston could do more of in open play is maybe get Aaron Malloy more on the ball in the attacking portions of the pitch. Now, they already do it plenty, but if they did it more, they'd be so dangerous every time they got the ball. And if you can fit into a shape a defensive midfielder like Landry in an attacking phase of the game, in a rest defense where they are pushed high up the field, they want to pin you in with the ball, and now you've got Landry out there who can sweep up any attempt to break and just snuff out a counterattack before it starts. Hey, I've got the ball. Let's give it back to Aaron. Let's create in the attacking third. To me, that's an ideal scenario for a Charleston team that wants to dominate games on the ball, firstly. They want to have 60% of the ball constantly every game, and they want to have 45% of the ball in your defensive third so they can control where you are and how they're creating. I think Landry gives them a chance to have more of the ball in more progressive spaces. And that's why I understand why you're trying to square peg, round hole him into that right back spot, because you can maybe phase him centrally when you're higher up the pitch and create a little better. Um, but you're always, I think, going to want a Segbers or a Blackstock or a natural right back in that role, just sheerly because they know what they're doing in that position. They can get higher and wider. They can create some width, which I think gives Malloy more
Yeah.
to exploit as well. You're always playing the fine lines, and as we talk about a lot in the early days of the season, John, right? It's good to have options and good to see how they fit against certain opponents. So when you encounter these shapes and encounter these oppositions later in the season, the business end of the year, you have better chances of finding the solution.
Yeah.
Charleston might be winless right now, but they know that they're the Charleston Battery. This isn't going to be a team on the playoff bubble. If they drop a couple points early in the season and the reward is figuring out what their team can be, it's worth that cost.
Yeah. I did want to finish off before we move on from this game on one more thought on Somersault and Maldonado. I just was curious, looking at the numbers previously. Now, this does not factor the championship experience that they've had over the last 38 games now, right, of regular season play. But Somersault is another guy who came up as well as Maldonado from League One, and I just thought that this number was kind of striking. So in 24 games that they played together in the League One level, Summersall and Maldonado, the record for NCSC, and this is only when these two guys were on the field at the same time, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that they started together. 17 wins, 3 draws, 4 losses. I'm like, okay, it makes sense. NCSC was a good team at the League One level, and these are players that clearly were above the level to some extent, so that makes sense. And then I looked at the record without at least one of these players playing. That record was 10 wins, 9 draws, 19 losses. So not only is there just a higher level of continuity and connectivity between these two because they've been playing together for 4+ years at this point, but there is at least some sample size to indicate that they play well together and it lifts the team in some meaningful way. So we'll keep tabs on whether or not that is the plan for NCFC, especially as they try to fit Olex Anderson back into the calculus going forward. Elsewhere in the league, do we have any observations from Tulsa's upset victory? I don't know if you can even call it that at this point, but over Sacramento Republic to kick the weekend off on Friday.
I would call it an upset victory. I would say that Sacramento's more talented. The expectation there is higher. I also am not fully sold yet on what Tulsa is. I think Tulsa is a very good team that does very bad team things from time to time, but they make up for it because they have expertly, in my opinion, built a back line that can solve problems. They have expertly built a midfield that can solve problems in the middle of games. And they have given Luke Spencer, the front office has given Luke Spencer a team that has enough pieces to do different things against different opponents. And that was the takeaway for me against Sacramento. Two teams that played very physically, and Tulsa, who is always the most physical team on the pitch, got out-physicaled in the first 45 minutes against Sacramento. And they made a change to be something a little different. They brought Marcos Serrato, who's more of this technical defensive midfielder, kind of similar to Giordano Colli, and they put Colli and Serrato on the pitch at the same time, had a little more control. They moved Colli out wide left. They gave a little more spacing, a little more control on the ball, and that got them back into the momentum of the game. And then they did a very Tulsa thing in 2025 and scored a set piece, and Taylor Calhera got off and running and had a great goal. And they just about did enough to beat a Sacramento team who was better than them on the day at home. And those are results at the end of the year when you were the worst of the two teams on the pitch, yet you got 3 points that are truly the difference between playoff team and home playoff team or playoff team and no playoff team. That's a really fine margin that Tulsa took advantage of and has taken advantage of a couple of times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you touched on it there, Ryan. John, something that you found worth noting was Colli's late game deployment. That's obviously going to be an important, I guess, strategy, you might call it, for Tulsa, because if they're going to win games, a lot of the time it will be going ahead and seeing it out, figuring out how to play those situations feels important, and you thought Colli had an interesting role in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to contextualize with the first half of this game where Sacramento, I think against expectation, played extremely direct. Their average pass traveled about 14 yards, which is twice league average, give or take, constantly going long and essentially playing Tulsa ball. And they did better than Tulsa at it, frankly, early on. It took a little bit of luck for FC Tulsa to start winning the second balls. And then about 60 minutes in, you see the change from Luke Spencer, where he realizes we need an extra body. We need somebody who can really contest these duels. And that's not a knock at Khalil Ahmedkar, who came out of the game, but it wasn't the matchup for him. So in moving Colli less into a true left wing role is more of this kind of left half space, shuttle between lines a little bit, but just get your body in the mix. Make sure you're occupying somebody when we're playing over the top. Add in Serrato, add in Boubacar Diallo in the midfield. It just gave Tulsa what they needed to anchor themselves in the final third, let the patterns develop, ultimately get the set piece that puts them over the line. It was a little bit of a brute force technique, like not the prettiest soccer you're ever going to see, but it's what the game called for. And I think it's evidential of why Luke Spencer has been so good at managing this team so far.
I think the thing that Luke Spencer's done the best job of is recognizing what's most important for this Tulsa team and what might be the most important thing for any team in the league, which is second balls. They are really good at winning that secondary opportunity. They weren't very good in the first half against Sacramento, in my opinion, at all. And that's why they lost. And they did lose a lot of the first ball. They lost a lot of duels, a lot of aerial duels, and then they weren't sweeping up the second one, right? They won a lot in the second half, and that's what Cauley gave them, I think, out wide, is you could go long to Calhera, and you could get a little bit more of a technical player underneath who is a little more physical than Almedkar, a little more about it, in all honesty, and you could play a little more. I think that's what Tulsa have done a really good job of. They've built a roster that's designed to win the first ball, but then also designed to win the second ball. And if they don't, they're in trouble. But more often than not this season, they've been able to do that. And I think that's why they've been so defensively successful to start.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of numbers that paint a picture that is similar to what you guys have brought to the table, but I do want to, yes, Ryan, numbers, hashtag does mean number. Not great from John. But yeah, no. So I think the observation I came away with, and this may be nominal, this may be stupid. I don't know. I'm not supposed to be the smart one on this show. But I think Tulsa has like brilliantly built a team and team concept to play on a narrow field, which they have. Numbers to back that up. 29% of their passes were long balls in this game. You mentioned the average travel of pass. Yeah, that tracks with that. To track with the set piece thing that Ryan said, and also the long ball part. In terms of their chances created, and for those uninitiated into the cult of nerddom, a chance created is just a pass that leads to a shot. It's almost like a pseudo assist, if you will. Only 2 came from the rest of the team. The rest came from Rogers, who had 4 at right-sided center back, which is not common. Again, some of that may have been from dead ball delivery, sure, but again, speaks to the overall idea of being direct on a very narrow surface. And then beyond that, and this might be the one that you can interpret in different ways and say that maybe Tulsa got a bit lucky to get a result given this profile of the game, but maybe this is also just a testament to the fact that they've been built to build a blockade in games and embargo their opponents from access to dangerous areas. Sacramento had 15 shots in this game. 10 of them were inside the box. 33 touches they had inside the opposition 18. That's a lot. How many shots on target do we think they had in the course of these 90 minutes and then some? 0. None. I don't know how that's possible. So, John, tell me if I'm right or wrong on this whole narrow pitch idea.
Narrow pitch, absolutely right. And I think the logic you're going through here of sometimes it's just as easy as you've got a narrow pitch, you've got 3 excellent center backs who are up for the physical battle. It doesn't always have to be the tactics in the scheme. FC Tulsa knows how they want to play. They've got 3 players who communicate well, constantly clog up the spaces in the box. Sacramento had their chances. They had a lot of sequences early on where Christian Pirano was dribbling all over the place around the 18-yard area. It didn't end up challenging Dowd in net. And that's what you want to see if you're Tulsa. You want to press in the best case scenario. You want to be the team that's aggressive, but you're willing to sit back. You've got the tools to sit back, especially at home, especially when your opponent doesn't have the room to work side to side. It's intelligent squad building, recognizing the context of your team.
Zero shots on target.
That is the number.
John, the name you said was not Johan Peñaranda, who's one of the best goalkeepers in the league. It was the backup goalkeeper. They put themselves in a position where they did not concede a lot of true opportunities with the backup goalkeeper in the game. They have 4 games played. All 4 of them, one way or the other, have been 1-0s. They've kept 3 clean sheets in 4 games. That's what Tulsa's going to be designed to do. And I think I love the back 3 balance. You mentioned you've got 3 really good center backs. They used AB Sissoko as kind of this just snuffer, right? They just threw him off on the backside of the number 9, Sebastian Herrera, and said, eliminate him from the game. If Sacramento's going to go long, you try and take him away from the box. And that's what they did. Herrera won a lot of these long balls. Sissoko didn't win a single aerial duel all game, despite being asked to be involved in a ton. But they removed Herrera from the 18-yard box, took away their dangerous goal scorer their big target striker away from his goal scoring spaces. And that allowed Lamar Bautista to have a ton of clearances. I think he had 14 or 15. And they allowed Arthur Rodgers to get a lot of secondary chances to then start play and go long and dump in behind. It's a really thought out puzzle. They have put it together. Every piece goes together really well. And that's why they've been so functional to start the season, Tulsa.
You talk about the narrowness, you talk about that center back relationship. Every time that Batista had the matchup against Pirano or Jack Gurr, the sideline wasn't that far away, but he wasn't letting them get to the end line. He was forcing them inside
Hmm.
into that clogged traffic where the shots were just going to be harder to put on goal. That's what you want to see if you're Tulsa.
Yeah, I've never seen Jack Gurr look as frustrated in a game as he did in this one. Again, a lot of that comes from the fact that, yeah, let's take this onto a wider surface and see what happens. I'm going to use an anecdote here. Union Omaha is an embarrassment of riches in League One. They have the assets and the thinking mind in Don Casciato, their manager, to do this. Not a lot of teams do. So, like, let's put that asterisk next to that. And no, Ryan, that's not a hashtag, that's an asterisk. Um, to me, well, the brilliance of Union Omaha is they built a team that can play on their narrow baseball field pitch and also spread their wings, so to speak, proverbially, and play a different way when they play everywhere else and still dominate. I don't think Tulsa has achieved that second thing yet. We'll see throughout the course of the year. But when they're on their home patch, especially if they're able to bolster enough points and get a home playoff game, there aren't a lot of teams that are going to have much joy trying to play through the middle of them, and they've done enough things structurally to limit the danger that they allow for in wide areas because they have two Terminators at center back that are going to win all the aerial balls and great guys in the form of Giallo and Coley and St. Clair who will win the knockdowns and get you clear and allow you to reset your defensive shape. I think that they are one of the teams that will have the most frustrating moments this year, and I think they will be the most frustrating games played for a lot of opposition teams that wander into Oklahoma on a Friday night and leave bumped and bruised.
I think the only other thing I'd say with Tulsa is, as you mentioned, over the course of a year, it's going to be something, and I think Caleb Sewell, the sporting director, has said as much. This is over the course of multiple years. They want to build a winner in Tulsa. They may not put all the pieces together this year. Their hope is that over the next 24 to 30 months, they find enough of those pieces to be just as effective on their narrow pitch, I'm sure, as like we've talked about, or they can go to a Phoenix and play on that wide surface there and have those spaces there. I think that's kind of the goal with Tulsa is they're
Yeah.
looking short term and hoping that progresses to a long term identity.
I do want to hit on the Sacramento of it all really quickly before we move out of here, but I also want to say this. It is a shame, and it was probably necessary because I imagine the transfer fee they inherited rolled over into acquiring some of these players. But it's a shame that Philip Goodrum is not on this team, not necessarily because of the footballing fit, but because, man, would he have enjoyed being the antagonist with this group. So, that's that. Sacramento, time to hit alarm bells at all yet for you as they figure things out under Neil Collins? Not exactly been a great, let's say, 120 minutes of consecutive play dating back to the Switchbacks game last weekend. Is there any concern for you, or is this just what Tulsa's going to do to teams?
I think a mix of both. Tulsa very much can dictate how a game is played. But even if you think back to like week one, Sacramento lost Ryan Spalding half an hour in. That was a player that was going to be absolutely critical to what they want to do on the left side. They're still getting Roro healthy. He got, I think, 15 to 20 minutes off the bench in this match. When Lopez is healthy, he's going to be one of the most important players in this team. And I think to an extent, Collins, much like Ben Pierman, is in a little bit of an experimental phase. Like we've seen different combinations in the central midfield. This was a game where he chose Justin Portillo instead of Nick Ross, probably because of Portillo's ties to Tulsa and kind of he's going to get up for that match. But I don't know if that's the number one pivot pair for this club. Ukegbu might not be the guy if they have healthy center backs. So I'm willing to give Sacramento a little bit more of a leash. And I give Collins credit for experimenting, frankly. Like going as direct as they
Sure.
did in comparison to a lot more of a controlled performance in prior weeks. That's interesting. That's what you want to see early in the season. They end up losing, but for 45 minutes, they looked like the dominant side. So no alarm bells yet, though I am concerned that they aren't as good as we maybe thought they might have been, given the high expectations.
Yeah, yeah. Portillo, extremely isolated was the thing that popped out looking at the average positioning and all these things. Didn't really feel like he and Luis Felipe were able to find that kind of meld, that relationism that's so important.
So I think, uh, John, I'm with you that Nick Ross is probably the better partner for Luis Felipe. I do think the best player out of Nick Ross and Justin Portillo is Portillo, though, in a vacuum, right? Like, this is a player who I feel is very good on the ball, a very good deep lying individual who can drop in. He's definitely past what was his best in the championship. But if you're going to play him in this kind of game, he's not the player that's going to fit in a long ball type environment. He only had 35 touches. He only had 19 passes. That's not enough, I think. If you were going to put Justin Portillo in the middle of a game, you want to utilize and play through him just a little bit more than they did, in my opinion.
Oh, I'm with you. I think Ross is somebody who is more willing to kind of relish the physical battle. You've
Sure.
seen him play in more of a half space advanced role before. He felt like he was a better fit for what they were trying to do, but that's the learning process as well. We don't know about his health. So many factors for Sacramento right now where I'm just willing to kind of give that pass.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm going to send Sacramento fans out of here at least with something to savor. I thought Christian Pirano was really good. Yeah. Yeah. Really like
Repeatedly
that
compared
player.
to Messi on the broadcast, so good for him.
That feels a little insane, but okay.
I mean, he had what, five touches inside the 18. He had, I think, 17 or so passes in the final third. He was the hub for them until Roro got on the pitch, and they're going to need that because we talk about
Hmm.
how important Roro is. We said this in the preseason podcasts. How reliant can you be on Roro Lopez? You want to be because he's such a good player, but can you be? You need somebody else to step up, and if Pirano can continue to be that player, it's a good sign for Sacramento long term.
Yeah. Okay. All right. On to Indy, where they were the home side for the first time this year. Had the opportunity to play in a place that was very friendly to them a year ago and in years past, a place that our very own John Morrissey is quite familiar with. They did some very interesting things with their defensive alignment, in my mind, despite ending up losing to the defending champs, Colorado Springs 3-2, one of the better games of the weekend. I was so, I guess, entrenched in the mindset that a mid block was going to look a certain kind of way. As an observation here, you kind of have two blocks of four, wall things off, prevent access to the pivot, whatever, force teams over the top of you and wide. They did some interesting things, John, in terms of the way that they choreographed that mid block. I saw moments personally where they would step almost into a 4-2-4, but also assign a higher line to that. The center backs and backline players would step up to shrink the space in between those lines when that happened. That's just something that I saw. I'm curious if you saw it as well, that I think could be an interesting wrinkle going forward. And personnel-wise, maybe there's some tweaks on that, but still could be a weapon for this team.
Oh, absolutely seeing hints of it. And it's an indie team that's been quite responsive in how they're lining up the defense week to week. Kind of the aggressor in week one against Miami for obvious Miami related reasons, sitting very deep against Lexington a week ago. This felt like more of a happy medium. And again, I know I'm harping on availability every time we talk about a team, but Ben Ofemu starting it right back probably was not the expectation for what Sean McCauley thought this team was going to be. But I think it played into the 4-2-4. Ofemu is somebody who has size and speed at that spot. He's a natural center back, but he can step up as needed. He can hold that high line if needed. In general, as well, like you saw Bruno Rendon kind of go out before this game he was
Yeah.
intending to start, and you get Oliver Brinius in there. That's not to plan, but the chemistry between him and Jack Blake on that kind of left central axis, very good on both sides of the ball. Were there moments where Indy was giving up space on either side of their pivot? Yes. Were some of the reactions and moments of communication a little bit wonky? Sure. But it's good for Indy to try to figure out what their identity is in the best case scenario when they can dictate the game.
And that's what I mean when I say it's kind of a weapon if they're able to figure out how to utilize this defensive structure, not only because it's going to keep teams off balance, that they'll shuffle into this thing, but beyond that, if they can find the midfield partnership that works to do this, it creates almost like a kill box, if you will, when teams try to play through you and the ball enters that very narrow space between the two lines of four. The right defensive midfielders are not only going to be able to win the ball in those situations, you have four guys ahead of them already to start the break. You're winning the ball in that middle area of the field, and you could be lethal as like almost an immediate second phase counter team. Do you think that that might be the goal that Indy's going for?
For sure. I mean, the thing about the Lexington game last week, even though Indy got a result, is their only ability to counter was driven on sitting in block for 2 minute spans and then hoping you can get a long ball to Malik Foster. That's not a sustainable model. You can't absorb pressure for that long. So if you cut out the middleman, you're holding a bit higher of a block, you're elevating the line of confrontation, and if you can quickly turn over the ball, get it to Aiden Quinn's feet, and then drive from there, that's a way to beat opponents, get past them before they can settle in. It seems like that's going to be the best version of Indy within Sean McCauley's kind of broad tactical oeuvre this season.
Is Quinn Murphy the right pivot for them? Right?
Yeah,
Is
that's the
Aiden,
question. Yeah.
especially in a 4-4-2, right? Like, is Aiden Quinn going to be able to have the legs with just one guy next to him within reason? Obviously, the 4-4-2 is designed to mask the two midfielders in some ways with other bodies around them. But is Aiden Quinn and James Murphy the right pair for Indy 11 to have success in the 2025 USL Championship season? That's the only question that I think I really have long term coming out of this game.
It's a fair question to ask.
Yeah, I'm somebody who's a James Murphy apologist. I think he's an excellent player with a really terrific read on space, someone who's very rarely caught out from where he needs to be. Less of an aggressive ball winner, and I think that's the aspect that Indy's really lacking. I wasn't overly impressed with Brem Sumaro when Indy brought him in at the end of 2024. He's still around, availability notwithstanding. He might be a better partner for Aiden Quinn, even if he isn't as good a player as James Murphy overall. In a perfect world, I'd love to see Cam Lindley getting those minutes. I think he's an inspired creator from deep areas. That feels more of you would need to play a midfield three with Lindley, Quinn, and a destroyer. But there are bodies here. McCauley has the ability to experiment. We're going to see more permutations of this midfield because it feels like the 11 are close. Yes, this game went south, but we liked the formula. I think all three of us were feeling pretty positive about the scheme, even if it didn't work. So positive signs despite the loss and despite the fact that we don't quite have that midfield answer.
Okay. On the other side of this game, Ryan, any kind of notions about where switchbacks are and some of the ideas that they're trying to employ?
Yeah, I also think, to close on Indy, it's hard to play a 4-4-2 with two midfielders that aren't the greatest of space, movers. They don't have the greatest of legs. When you're playing a Colorado team that was very astutely finding pockets of space, utilizing their midfield. They lose Speedy Williams, they lose Jairo Enriquez, they lose Tyreek McGee. The latter two, Enriquez and McGee, very much dynamic on the ball drivers. They can, move in an instant. They can create space for themselves. And they replace them with Charlie Adams and they replace them with Anthony Fontana, who are, by my view, slightly more of interpreters of like, hey, where's the pocket? Where can I find the space to turn and then move the ball again? And that's the difference, I think, for Colorado at the start of this year versus the end of last year. They've lost some of the immediate dynamism they had in that midfield, and they've changed it to more of a stable. We're going to move the ball into certain spaces. The most dynamic midfielder I think they currently have would be Quincy Hewerman, and he's not half the player on the ball. It felt like that McGee and Enriquez were as drivers, and that's the challenge that they're facing. But it came to their aid, I think, against Indy because they had all these guys who could find pockets against an undermanned midfield, and that created the space for them to attack. And I do love, and John, I think you wrote about it in your article on Backheeled a little bit, how they used Charlie Adams and how they decided, hey, we've got all these different players that kind of do not similar things, but have similar qualities. How do we get the best out of them? And I think they really got the best out of Charlie Adams.
Pre-injury, Adams was essentially dropping in, much like we discussed with Aaron Malloy, becoming the third center back in what looked like a 3-5-2 build shape. And it had upsides in a couple of ways. You activated someone like an Anthony Fontana in the half space, gave him a little bit more room to work in the midfield. You let Jonas Feldberg tuck in a little bit. I thought he was very good receiving on the turn, something we don't always see from him given his deployment. Equally important was the defensive structure. When you think about the 3-5-2, obviously you've got an extra body at the back. Like it's just simple math. You're able to split a bit wider, have players like a Garvin Medusala at center back take up a wider position. And for a team like Colorado Springs that has been beaten at the fullback spots consistently throughout 2025, having a little bit more flexibility, making it easier to rotate and cover at those spots was really critical. Against an indie team, no less, that knows how to use Malik Foster, really was clever about Bernays and the way he was making runs on the left. That could have been a danger point, and I think by and large, because of the way they set themselves up, because of that rest defense scheme, they skirted a lot of those issues and got the win.
It's the Bielsa, the modern math of Marcelo Bielsa, which is you're playing two up top, we need three back. We need to have the extra man there. And as you pointed out, right, you can cover wide spaces more effectively. Charlie Adams isn't the athlete that's going to cover those wide spaces. You don't really have that anymore in this team. So use your athletic center backs to step a little wider, to cover some of these wider areas, to cover the channels if there is a ball in behind. And, Charlie Adams can be your fulcrum to move the ball when you do have it.
Yeah. And obviously, it is important to track that Adams had to come off early in this game. He's an older player. We will keep an eye on whether or not he can remain fit. And if he's available in the immediate term, there's a big game to be played this weekend against New Mexico, two of the teams that were some of the best in the West a season past. Again, I just think you come back to the fact that, all right, in my mind, Fieldberg, you've been waiting for this breakout for years. You're hoping that it's finally arriving. He's playing some of his best stuff right now, and the question is, can he sustain it for more than 5 games or so? If that's the case, you like Hanya on the other side. You're going to figure out what's going on with the 9. You have good options there. Dylan has scored a bunch of goals already to start this year. You feel good about that. It is what you do with that midfield 3 that I think is basically, in summary of all that's been said, what will determine what switchbacks can and cannot do this year, correct? Okay.
Absolutely. They will go as far as that midfield carries them.
Yep. Seems to be a theme around the league this year. It's almost like midfield is important for controlling games and doing things.
No.
No? Okay,
No.
Cool. Glad for sharing your opinion. Wrong. Next thing. So there was a game that was played between Rhode Island and Loudoun. There were several games that were played around the league, but this one was in Virginia. And we're not going to talk too much about this because we've talked a lot about both these teams already. But as we were moving through this, I felt like I would be remiss not to at least pose the question, especially to John. Have you seen a 10 making a bigger impact just from goal danger in general? Have you seen a 10 playing like Abdulatif Abukora is currently playing?
I don't think it's controversial to say he is at least the hottest player in the league right now. Nobody is making more of a consistent impact. In a game where Loudoun quite often struggled to access the attacking areas, Abukora had that moment of magic in him, that intangible ability to pick up a touch off a turnover, perhaps, like we saw in the first goal, ride the pressure on his back, dribble between 2 defenders, and then finish. He wasn't the most involved early in that game, but as soon as he had an opportunity, taking advantage of it. Same thing on the second goal. That's a quick throw in. He's slicing from the left to the right, making an absolute clown of Frank Nodarce in the process to slam home another goal. Loudoun was good. I liked a lot of their process, but they were elevated by the fact that Abukora is on an absolute heater right now. It's a special player, and it's special performances from him.
Yeah, it changes what a team can do. We've talked about Loudoun throughout this year and applauded the team concept around Abukora, right? And how they've been able to amplify his skill set. But it was about team performances. This is the first time this year, it's a brief introduction to the year, absolutely, only match week 4. The first time this year, though, where really across the league, a player just said, all right, guys, you're coming with me. And that doesn't necessarily happen that much in the USL. No. He better stop playing so well or else they're going to be suitors, and I don't know what Loudoun does from that point, Ryan. This was one of the better performances we've seen this year.
I think to answer the question that you asked, John, we've certainly seen better performances from over stretches of games from dudes in this league. I'm sure Solomon Asante had about 7 different stretches of games where he was better
Sure,
in a 3 or 4 game stretch.
sure.
I don't know, and I'm much newer to this world than John is, even though we've both been around Peyton. I don't know if we've seen a guy. I've seen a guy make the jump in the span of 3 months. It feels like that Abdulatif Abukora has made. He has become the most impactful piece in the league through the first month of the season because of those abilities. He can ghost and then arrive. He can control and continue to do so. What you ask him to do, what the defense, what the opposition asks him to do, he does. He played against a Rhode Island team this past week that essentially decided that we were going to stop you, and they could not. That is a story that I think is really important there amidst a Loudon team that is doing wonderfully unique and interesting tactical things. Ryan Martin continues to prove that he is that good, but now Ryan Martin is that good, has a really good team, and an absolute dude on the left side. That means you've got a top 4 team in the Eastern Conference, and you could be breaking into that trident that we thought was untouchable at the beginning of the season back in February.
Yeah, I think that there's a clear separation that is happening in the quality in the East. Um, Not ready to do anything with the slow start for Charleston, the slow start for Rhode Island. We banged on Rhode Island enough last week. We're not going to do it every week. We'll check back in a month when Kano has stopped experimenting as much, if he has. And they'll figure out what's going on. They're too good not to. That said, I think I might be higher on one of these two teams than the rest of you, but I think NCFC and Loudon have clearly illustrated that they are the middle class of the East, and then there's everybody else behind that top three.
They've elevated themselves to a point that's closer to the big three
Exactly.
than the others have, and they're probably closer to those three, John, I'd say, than they are to the other. What's the math here? 7? Yeah,
Yes,
7.
yes on the math and yes on the conclusion that I think they feel a cut above a lot of the rest of the conference.
They have a gear, right? They have that level where when they are flowing, and they are, whether it's on the counter or in possession, they can step up to the level of the 3 teams that we think are above the rest in this league, let alone the Eastern Conference. They can't do it as consistently to be an elite team, I think, yet, but they can get there. Whereas I think a lot of other teams, even in the West, really can't.
Okay. Open gym time. No set games that we'll focus on. This is where you boys pretty much pick your own adventure, fill in the Mad Lib. Other observations you guys jotted down throughout the course of the weekend.
Love to talk a bit about Pittsburgh, who, if I'm making an argument for any team that could push up into that tier, the Riverhounds fit the bill. The squad selection is always a mystery with Bob Lilly. It felt very intentional, very effective against Birmingham. Essentially, they're running a 4-2-3-1 or a 4-1-4-1. Every player in that midfield is a center mid by trade. They're going quite narrow. They're playing long like you'd expect out of Pittsburgh. But I thought the way that those 5 players weaponized themselves in the counterpress was extremely effective, constantly trapping the Legion in these almost square shape alignments, bending, making sure you've got cover on the weak side if you need it. It let them play with their food for about 70 minutes of this game until they got the 2-0 lead. And you think about that goal sequence in particular, you can find it like 68th minute. This is a play that starts going long. Augie Williams, he's going to contest the header. He doesn't care if he wins it. He just wants the knockdown. Immediately, led by Aiden O'Toole, you've got 4 center mids crashing to win the ball. As soon as they regain, you work to the weak side, and Birmingham isn't ready for that. That is Pittsburgh in a nutshell. We tend to think of them as being very negative, very defensive, but they use their press as a weapon to find those moments to break. And I think it's innovative in a way for Bob Lilly, but it's something that's always been their identity. And the fact that they're finding it in March rather than July like they did last year bodes very well for the Riverhounds' chances.
I think it's more of a focus this year for Pittsburgh, partially because instead of playing the cat and mouse game that they did the last year and a half with Kennardo Forbes, the key creator that he was, it was, you're not there anymore. You can't give us the minutes that we need you to. So, in a much nicer way than this, be gone, right? Like, we're going to move you to a different role. You're still valued by this group, but you can't help us here. What can help us, and I thought it was really interesting, you mentioned four midfielders, four central midfielders. You're counting Sample, you're counting O'Toole, you're counting Griffin, and I would assume Robbie Mertz, right? Who's listed as a left midfielder. I think that's the most interesting thing they do, and they've been doing it for a little while now, the balance of that left side, where Mertz is super free, allowed to play underneath the striker, which now is Augie Williams. It's a much, much, much better position to be in than they were last year, and they get Junior A2 flying up the field, and they give him the space to attack. And I think that's where Bob Lilly has really come along this year, saying he's come along after he's been around longer than my parents have been alive probably at this point, right, is crazy. But he's found a gear in this team that is, we're going to lean into what we want to lean into, and we're going to fully commit to the industriousness that our team is. And they're really fluid in midfield. They've got three guys who can kind of do the same thing. They let Mertz be the player. They give A2 the space. They've got a goal scorer in Williams now. They have the chance, and I think that's what you were saying when you started it with, by Pittsburgh can make that next step like North Carolina and Loudoun can. They have all the ingredients to be that team that can find that gear. I don't know if we've necessarily seen them fully hit it yet, at least in my opinion, but they certainly have the ingredients to do so.
I think the interesting thing with A2 in this game in particular, one of his more reserved performances, very clearly because they wanted an extra body back against the possibility of Preston Tabordataka breaking out. Preston ends up completing 8 passes in more than 70 minutes and getting one touch in the box. Meanwhile, so you're nullifying him, and then meanwhile upfield,
Yeah.
Mertz was so expansive, constantly probing in that left channel. If you needed him to tuck in and do a defensive job, he was there for it, and I think that's why Bob Lilly trusts him. But flashing a little bit of inspiration as a runner did wonders for the balance of Pittsburgh.
And Robbie Mertz might be the player in 2 or 3 years if he's still at Pittsburgh. We might look back and he obviously Kennardo Forbes will define Bob Lilly as a coach in terms of the player that was most valuable and most influential for Bob Lilly. But Robbie Mertz might be the most, Bob Lilly ever player. A guy who came into this league as one thing at the college level, was thought you were going to do a job, and has now blossomed into a very important piece, and a piece that has the freedom to operate in a very different way. That's, I think, the lovely thing about Bob Lilly is every year we find a guy that he brings in that can kind of do something you wouldn't have expected them to do. Now Robbie Mertz has been that guy for the last couple of years and has become sort of the personification of what Bob Lilly's style of football really does to players and does to teams that he coaches.
Okay, so from the sweet prince of pragmatism that is Bob Lilly to maybe something that is a wider pragmatic ideal in the way that it's understood by people the world over, league over, but something that I know both of you have picked up within Birmingham, but also across the division, is more of a defensive structure built out of a 4-4-2. Pittsburgh has employed some of that. It feels like it's starting to be a trend that's caught on. I know it's an observation both of you guys shared throughout the course of this weekend.
Yeah, it started. I was obviously Phoenix was on the road in Monterey, who has been the primary deployer of that 4-4-2 to start the season. To great effect, by the way. They are really tight in between the lines vertically. They're really great at attacking channels in the attacking sense there. But when I watch games, I see more often than not, more often than not this year and more than in years past, teams opting to defend in a 4-4-2. And I think today I wanted to talk about mostly, with you, John, if you're seeing the same observation, but more importantly, the fact that the 4-4-2 is not the pub league 4-4-2. It's not the stereotypical sit back and defend and don't concede. It is that you can be progressive in a 4-4-2 as a pressing system. You can align yourself in the middle of the pitch in a blockade there in a 4-4-2. It is so often the defensive shape of choice for teams because of its fluidity that creates, in this weird way, a solidity for your team.
I think the benefits of the 4-4-2 are kind of easy to overlook, easy to take for granted when you're thinking about this league. The 4-4-2 is great because it's easy to organize your lines and it's easy to move from side to side, make sure you're staying compact and denying certain areas of the pitch. But the evolution this season has been from teams like Sacramento that they're running a 4-4-2, yes, but constantly letting the ball side winger get up, moving into what looks like a 4-3-3, but out of that 4-4-2 base to make sure you can address a team that's building out with additional players, to make sure you can always have that base up pressure against the center backs. We've seen it with Monterrey as well, where they're really driving through the central midfield. Those are the players that are at the nexus of what that shape is trying to do. I agree completely that we've seen more of it this season, but the beauty of the shape is how customizable it is, how many different versions of what the
Yeah.
4-4-2 can be have
Yeah.
prevailed.
We
That feels
saw
like the
with-
key thing. That feels like the key thing is the customizable nature of how it can be almost modular in how you use it.
It's fluid, right? You can do what you want with it. And we saw that with Monterrey. We've talked about it a lot with Phoenix this year. A team that wants to build through the center of the park, that wants to find its six and wants its six to make smart, simple decisions to progress the ball to Noble Okello and to progress the ball to Hope Avayevu, who's been phenomenal this year. Well, what does Monterey Bay do to counteract that? They take Anton Soyberg, who we've raved about on the show in the past couple of weeks, on the ball, and as a striker that's dropping in. And they took him this week and they said, nope, you're right next to your partner up top in Elijah Paul, and your job is to slam here in the middle and make sure that Phoenix Rising cannot progress through the middle of the park. Don't let them do what they want. And I think that's the valuable thing with it, is it is super adaptable in the way that you can do this, and then as soon as a team decides, okay, well, they're cutting this out, if Phoenix decided all of a sudden we need to go long, which is what happened in that game a lot, they decided they needed to play long, mostly to Isan Sako off the right wing, where they thought they could have had an advantage against Grant Robinson physically. Well, now all of a sudden you can shift that 4-4-2 and give a little bit of help and drop maybe a midfielder in to help with second balls. And that's kind of what happened a lot, is you saw a lot of secondary balls find Wes Fonguk's feet in a 4-4-2 defensive shape off of Robinson or off of Sacco on that other side, on that same side for Phoenix and Monterey. And it just gives you solutions in every possible space. And
Mm-hmm.
that's become what world football is about, right? It's
Yeah.
about finding problems
Yeah.
in the moment, not about starting from jump, not about having this picture perfect build up that solves everything no matter what, but being able to interchange and move around into whatever the opposition or the field is giving you. And that's what I think has made the 4-4-2 a jump in popularity, at least through the first month of the season.
I'm going to summarize all that tactical alphabet soup into one simple kind of progression of ideas. It's almost a domino effect. By playing the 4-4-2, you have two strikers that create a box with the midfielders that limit you from accessing the central area of the field. That forces you wide, where teams then set traps using the touch line to make it difficult to progress the ball in the wide areas, and you force turnovers, leaving you one recourse. To play long, smart teams build with big center backs that can win those balls and midfielders that are busy enough to win the second ball, and then you've won possession and you've done your job defensively. I think that's the idea, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Speaking of teams that press, I did want to note, I was watching Louisville City and I was watching Detroit, and it did not look like it was a very enjoyable time for Detroit this weekend. Playing Louisville City's press this year feels worse than trying to embark on the Oregon Trail to the other end of the field. It will give you dysentery. I'm going to note the stat. I'm just going to note the stat every weekend going forward just to keep a pulse on it. Action areas for this game. Percentage of play occurring in the Louisville defensive third, 18%. Percentage of play occurring in the Detroit defensive third, 36%. Percentage of possession. Detroit had 60% of the ball and couldn't get out of their own half. This should not be allowed, what Louisville is doing to teams. Also, just beneath all of that, Ray Serrano and Perez have been excellent too, and I just don't think that's getting talked about enough. These are my observations.
The defense thing, we've talked about it a lot. Press is so immaculately organized and good about controlling space. Notably, a team that runs the 3-4-3, so you don't have to be a 4-4-2 team in this league. Perez and Serrano, unbelievably good. The movement that they bring to the table is delicious. Like
Mm.
Perez, both of them really, Manny, Adrian, either one, so good about working off of each other on the right side. Very good about those crisscrossing runs that really trap a fullback and force them into decisions. And so often Louisville is driving through Taylor Davila in the right half space. He's setting the table. He's forcing the defense to bend that way. Once that happens, enter Ray Serrano, who's lurking on the left side, constantly making himself available. If you watch him play and really hone in on Ray Serrano's game, excellent about scanning for space, opening his body to receive at whatever angle, and immediately turning towards goal and then weaponizing that when he gets the touch. A fantastic player, only 22 years old, I believe, who keeps getting better every time you watch him play.
Mm-hmm. And the timeline for replacing Brian Ownby obviously expedited last year with the injury, commending their front office for finding players that were suited to not only do that, but progress the tactical identity of this team in that role.
You find talented players who are not only among the best in terms of talent in the league in their position, but are bought into an identity that requires them to do things that are hard, that requires them to run and requires them to chase. That's an exceptional coaching job, 10 out of 10 times. It's wild that you can get guys like Davila and guys like Perez to work as hard as they do at times because they are so good and they have to know it. And that is why I think Danny Cruz is getting popularity amongst the higher levels of the US ladder because he's getting really good players that are above most of the players in this league on talent alone,
Mm-hmm.
work even harder and make it that much easier for them to again dominate the crap out of everybody they play.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. Again, it's dominance. That's the key word. You said it. Louisville, while everybody else that is a near peer adversary for Louisville City this year experiments and fiddles, Louisville are just resolved to dominate everybody they line up against, and somehow Birmingham has the only point secured against them on the year. Make that make sense. Okay. Anything else from across the wide spectrum of this wonderful, chaotic sphere of existence we call the USL?
You're the schedule makers, making me start my Saturday of constant USL with El Paso and Hartford at 2 in the afternoon. That's cruel stuff right there. So learn from that.
I feel so bad for a player of the talent of Mamadou Jang who just doesn't seem to be getting enough of. I don't even want to say he deserves because if he deserved it, he'd be finding something here and there. But man, it just feels like there's a really good player there that could be a really important piece for another team in this league, and Hartford has not taken advantage of that. And I think I love how all the big teams can experiment at the beginning of the year, and we very quickly can find out, hey, this team is probably slow, this team has stepped up, but we also very clearly can rope 3 or 4 teams into that 21 to 24 range. And we've found that to be Miami, expected, Oakland, expected towards the tail end of the offseason, and Hartford, who have been worse than you would have anticipated them to be. I'd be curious, is Birmingham closer to them than they are the middle of the pack? Is Las Vegas going to get something going? Are they closer to the bottom three than the middle of the pack? That's the next month for those teams that are trying to find out if they're the eighth best team, seventh
Mm-hmm.
best team in their conference, or if they need to blow it up in the middle of the year and start to think about 2026. That's always a really big challenge for some of
Sure.
these teams to start slow.
Okay. I'm going to speed run through the rest of the games. If you guys have something that's a burning thing you want to say, feel free to hop in. Okay. Oakland and Las Vegas. We talk about it, except nothing happened. So probably not going to do that. New Mexico United and Miami FC. New Mexico, you deserve to be talked about. We haven't done that much. We'll do it next week after you play switchbacks and we get a really good measure of where both teams are, unless Ryan wants to do it right now.
No, I wanted to point out, I think John said something about this earlier. Miami related issues.
Yeah, sure.
should be added into the injury lexicon. It should be he's out with a hand injury, a red card. Miami related issues is a new thing we are going to hinder teams for.
Miami related issues sounds like another thing that sounds much more problematic than Miami FC. I'm going to say this though, Miami FC look a little bit more plucky and feisty every week we go by. So,
Miami almost doubled New Mexico in shots, and this was a game that was in a dead heat for the majority of the match. The big change for me, Bolo Akinyote in the pivot. I don't know if it's like a preference thing where he's telling coaches, I want to be a center back. It's very clear for my taste that he is better in the center of the pitch. A couple good passes, lots of destruction. That's going to be big if he stays there.
yep.
The Dariush Formella of further down the pitch.
Yeah. You do not want to see Bolo in the pit, man. You don't want to see Bolo in the pit. We should start calling the stadium the pit.
Yes.
This is my petition. Okay. Other games. Rising, Monterey Bay, we touched on it briefly. Rising have scored 7 goals this year. They have been leading for 0.00 seconds. That does not really add up. 2 + 2 = 4. Ryan, you were on site for it. I don't think you think we need to talk about it more other than Monterey Bay continue to be a good team. That's fine.
No, when you've got nine first team players injured, and next week you play on national television, and you add to those 9 with 2 sending offs, you are having to solve problems like never before. I am relatively certain we get the chance to talk to Pamadou Ka this week. Very curious to pick his brain on if he has encountered something like this in his career, where he has a 23-person first-team squad, plus a very good academy player in Braxton Montgomery. So really 24 first-team players. And you have to play your assistant coach a year and a half removed from retirement.
Yeah.
In a game this early in the season. I'm very curious to ask him if he has experienced a challenge like this in his coaching or professional playing career.
Yep. Nope. I realized during the game, and this made me feel quite old. Darius Schwarmella and Darnell King are the only remaining active players still with Phoenix Rising, apparently, that started the final.
Started the final. I was going to cut you.
Yeah, Emi Cuello did play.
Cuello came off the bench. Rakovsky was on the bench. Traore may have started the final.
Oh, that's a good point. Yes, he definitely did.
Traore definitely did. Yeah.
He definitely did. He definitely did.
Yeah. Still.
Okay, I stand corrected. That was wrong. Okay, elsewhere, the other half of that equation between Rising and San Antonio next week, of course, is San Antonio. They're the only team in the league, by my accounting, that has won all the games that they have played. That's pretty good. We talked about San Antonio as well as Lexington a whole bunch of times. That may have been the best game of the weekend. Just kind of got pushed to the back burner because of the fact that we want to show love to everybody that's not New Mexico, apparently. Okay. Any other things to say?
I think Lexington signing 2 more players somehow. Michael Adedokun, who was a really good player in college. I encourage you to watch his highlight tape. It is very, very fun against very clearly undermanned college defenses against a player of his caliber. And then Hugo Mbongwe, who, former San Antonio player himself, has spent a couple of stops in this league. They are continuing to just add arrows and saying, hey, eventually we're going to need to use these players or find use for these players. I think that's really smart front office work. And Terry Boss is probably the exact opposite of Pamadou Ka right now. He is sitting feet up in his office saying, this is amazing, but now his new problem is I've got 25 dudes who could probably play, and I need to find a way to get 20 of them, 18 of them into my match day squad. That's a real challenge for him.
Maldonado to Mbongwe all the way through. That's a show, folks. Soccer's on this weekend. You should probably go and watch it. We'll talk to you soon.